Hello, I'm Cyndy Cathcart. What is your story? I would like to introduce you to my friend, Kathleen Mallett. Kathleen is going to read a story about sexual abuse.
I grew up in an outwardly normal home, upper middle class. Mother, father, and 2 siblings. However, when my family was behind closed doors, life was a nightmare. It was full of abuse and chaos. Both my parents were merciless in their abuse of each other and of us, their children. I don't remember a time when I felt safe in the confines of that house. At the age of 6, my sexual abuse began. It happened at the hands of my paternal grandmother. The abuse began when she and I were alone in her house. She would walk into a room and expose her breasts. Even at the age of 6 years old, I knew something was wrong. I looked away. She began the grooming process by telling me it was okay. She explained that it was her job to teach me what my body parts were used for, and that I would need to know these things later in life. My grandmother told me I would be in trouble if I told anyone of what she called the lessons. I believed her. The sexual abuse continued for the next 5 to 6 years. The memories of domestic abuse and sexual abuse have haunted me for many years. I never felt normal. I distanced myself from caring and healthy relationships. In my teens and early 20s, I was promiscuous and would not allow myself to trust anyone. I am estranged from my one surviving sibling. I have no idea what my siblings suffered through. I carry the guilt and shame for never speaking out. I share this small bit of my story in the hope it may help someone who is suffering. Please don't suffer in silence. There is hope.
Thank you, Kathleen. Kathleen, what would you say to the person who wrote the story if you could talk to that person today?
First of all, I would say thank you for sharing your story with me and allowing me to read this today. And then next I would say what courage and strength it takes to publicly come forward with this story of abuse. And I'm so proud of the person that shared this letter with me.
Would you like to meet that person?
I would.
Greg, could you please come forward? This is my husband, Greg. Greg, I would like for you to meet Kathleen. This was Greg's story.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathleen, for reading Greg's story, and thank you, Greg, for sharing your story today. You were very brave.
Thank you.
You've met the man who was healing. I'd like for you to meet the boy who was wounded. Please take a look at this photograph and see the man that stood before you and see this child, this boy who was wounded. Let's hold a safe space for him today, please, because it's very brave to come out and talk about sexual abuse, especially for males. Research has found that at least 1 in 6 men have experienced sexual abuse or assault either in childhood or as an adult. That is a staggering number. That's made even more staggering because that's an estimate that's based on self-disclosures and self-reporting. We really don't know how many men are suffering in silence. Why is this so important? Given that 1 in 6 men will experience sexual abuse or trauma, we all have a story because we live with, we work with, we go to the grocery store with, we're raised by, we raise, and we love men. We all have a story. Greg has agreed to allow me to share more of his story. And because I now know he is 1 in 6, I have a story as a loved one. Like many victims, he was surviving the way he was taught by his abuser, and society told him a man should be. Take the pain. Don't talk about it. Control what you can. Don't do anything that's not well thought out, or you'll be in trouble. Detach from your feelings when you're intimate. He sought out a profession that had clear structure and thus gave him some control over his life. He participated in risky and physically painful behaviors because he wanted to die. He wanted to inflict physical pain on his outward body so that the inward pain would be less. Even more heroic for him, he says he chose a career in law enforcement and was thinking about how glorious it would be to die and have a flag-draped coffin. He then decided to continue his education as a distraction. While everything he did was considered heroic and manly, he was making decisions that would propel his career through his education in other directions. It only worked for a short period of time. He didn't die. He retired early. Rock climbing and tattoos and hours in the gym became much more painful as he got older and much more difficult. Then he moved to work in helping professions using his education, but the pain remained. I knew about his PTSD from law enforcement. I knew about his trauma from childhood domestic violence. One day, after we both thought he had healed from his PTSD, I found him sitting alone in a room preparing to take his own life. And by preparing, I mean he had the room ready. Some force, somewhere, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was God. I don't know if it was the universe. I don't know if it was a greater power. But I made the decision to come home early that day, and I found him there. You see, what I realized that day, the shame of being a child of domestic violence, the shame of having PTSD from law enforcement was much easier for him to break than the shame of the story you just heard. Because like other victims, he believed his abuser in society. They are ashamed they didn't stop it. They are ashamed they didn't tell anyone. They are ashamed they didn't know what was happening to them. And even more so with boys, they were ashamed of how their body was responding to the abuse. Some hold this shame for almost 50 years like he did, and some even longer. That day together, we started the long and difficult, frustrating road to find help for him. Given that 1 in 6 men are victims of childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual abuse, you would think there would be a lot of resources out there, wouldn't you? The places we called that said they provided services for men provided services for men who were perpetrators, not victims. Couldn't find any. The professional who had treated him for his PTSD said to us bluntly, what we have found is that peer support in conjunction with traditional talk therapy is what works best for sexual trauma. Unfortunately, I don't have any resources for you. I can refer you to PTSD peer support. I can refer you to a first responder's peer support, but I don't have anything for male abuse victims. As a woman my age, talking about sexual abuse or assault is relatively easy for us. We are traditionally talkers. Women talk about what happened to them. For the most part, we share our stories about everything. I do. The Me Too movement offered many of us the freedom to share more than we had previously. 1 in 4 women have been sexually assaulted or abused. And when I talk to my female friends, I know that number is much greater. So I bet you the number for men is greater. Survivors, loved ones, and those who treat survivors, we have to begin to tell our stories, all of us, so that men and boys realize there is hope and healing. That is peer support in its purest form. This is peer support. What we're doing here is peer support. It's that simple. It's not that hard. When stories are told, victims know they're not alone. They no longer hear that voice inside their head that says, nobody will believe you. Because when they're listening to someone else tell that story, they're looking at that person and saying, I believe them. I believe them. That has to be a true story because it happened to me. And then they realize, I can start breaking down these walls. They have an aha moment and realize people do believe them and that they didn't cause this to happen because they look at that other person and realize that person didn't cause it to happen, so I must not have either. When they gather to tell their stories in a safe place, like I've just asked you to hold for us, they realize they can begin to trust people. And in turn, they can trust their loved ones. Because you see, victims, especially of childhood sexual trauma that occurs in the home, they can't trust their loved ones. They don't. It doesn't matter how much I loved him. He couldn't completely trust me. He had a wall built up. There was a wall there. And the more victims are able to talk with other victims, the more that wall begins to come down. Maybe just cracks at first. Maybe just cracks at first. But it will begin to come down, and it becomes less high and less thick. And eventually, it will start to fall. So few men are getting the help they need, and it's tragic how many are suffering needlessly. How can we support the men and boys in our lives? Pretty easy. Tell our stories. The more we tell our stories, the more free others are to begin to tell theirs. The less shame there is in disclosure. Through this, we can start to show younger children and adolescents that the earlier they disclose, the earlier they seek help, the more free they will become from the chains of shame and self-destructive behaviors, and they won't have to wait 50 years to tell their story. In one survivor's words, there is no greater feeling than breaking your silence and learning to be your authentic self. Men will tell their stories if we give them a safe space. They'll take back their lives, they will reach out to help others, and they will provide hope to others. And when you have hope, you can start to heal. In order to make a space for healing and hope, we must be willing to say, I see you. This does happen to men. This does happen to boys. And we need to make safer spaces for men to share their experiences with other men and with us. What is your story? How and where will you tell it? Thank you.